It's an early start today, even by our standards. We are up with the school kids and the dog walkers here at the AXA Training Centre because Arne Slot is ready to do his pre-match press conference, and I'm about to do something I don't normally do, which is talk to you before the press conference rather than after. And the reason I'm doing that, and the reason I'm here so early, I'm in a bit of a quandary here. I've got quite a few good questions I think I can ask him. I'm still not quite sure which ones I want to ask him. I could ask him about Ryan Gravenberch and his defensive skills. I could ask him about Kai Gordon and Stefan Bajcetic and the loan system. I could ask him about Liverpool clearly hating draws and going for the win every single time. But I'm not sure which one I'm going to ask him yet. I guess I'm going to have to make that decision over the next 10 minutes, and well, you're going to have to stay tuned to find out exactly which one I choose. Well, here we are again. Now, the words that you often hear me say when I'm talking about the press conference are interesting, fascinating, and those are both true. I'd add a third one in there today, illuminating. One thing I always loved about Arne Slot is the fact that he probably says more than he should. I dare say that the press officer sitting next to him probably feels like he should rein it in a little bit sometimes, but that is to the benefit of all of us who are sitting here trying to get some clues out of exactly what he said, and there were plenty of fascinating clues to take from what he said today. Now, he spoke about referees, he spoke about the suspension, he spoke about team news, he spoke about his own philosophy, he even spoke a little bit about his own coaching staff, and we're going to get into all of that once we get back to the lab. Here we are once again in the safe confines of the lab, ready to pick through all of Arne Slot's takes in his pre-match press conference and discover exactly what they mean. I did have my little dilemma before we started. I wasn't entirely sure what I was going to ask him, but as it turned out, I had some help from some very, very important people within the sphere, and we'll get to that in a little bit. As you know, there's a hierarchy as we go through these things. My top 3 takeaways will be coming very soon, but before that, it's my pleasure to announce that there was no contract questions this time. Thankfully, we didn't hear anything about it. There was no new news, no new rumours, so we could just skip on past them, just like I'm doing now. And we aren't going to talk about the injuries ahead of my top 3 takeaways because they take part in them. So let's get to that number 1. Top takeaway number 1. We have some good and some bad news. Now, the good news, let's start with that first. Kostas Tsimikas trained today, which was a bit of a surprise to a lot of people. That means that you're probably not in contention to be in the squad for Southampton tomorrow, but he's got a good chance of making the squad for Spurs, which is a massive boon for those of us who are slightly concerned about Andy Robertson and the amount of games that he's currently having to play. Getting Kostas back will just ease some of that burden on him and obviously on the whole defence, particularly Joe Gomez as well, who's another left-back option. So I wouldn't expect to see Kostas in the squad for Southampton, as we say, but he will be back very soon, which is good news. Now the bad news. Unfortunately, Diogo Jota, who thrilled us all with his cameo against Fulham, unfortunately he felt something after that game and he didn't train today. Now, fear not, it's not bad enough to rule him out of the game completely, but Slot did say that he wasn't able to start, which is still a blow because the hope was he would be able to start in this game, build up some good minutes, maybe get 60, 65 minutes, and then be ready to go again against Spurs. Now, that still may be the case that he's available to start the game against Spurs, but it's a tough one. It really is a tough one because it just shows how brittle he is at the moment. It's funny, we were talking about this, me and some friends, after the game, and he's very much entering that Daniel Sturridge territory for good and for bad, in as much as when he comes back, it's like he's never been away. It was remarkable how many times Daniel Sturridge scored on his return from injury. But then it was very remarkable how many times he was then out again very soon afterwards. And I mean, we've seen it with some other clubs. We saw Mason Mount at the weekend. We know about this with Reece James. Once you get into that cycle of injuries, it's very, very hard to get out. And he can be so vital to this team, Diogo Jota, if you can just keep him fit. So the question then becomes, if he is fit enough to play some minutes against Southampton, what do you do? Do you give him some minutes there with the hope of maybe him being ready to start against Spurs? Or do you completely sit him against Southampton, take the hit, and then say maybe he can come on against Spurs and look to start maybe the next game against West Ham? It's a really tough balancing act because he's such a fantastic player, such a really key element to the squad to be able to bring on quality from the bench, but we have to be so careful with him. Someone else who we're having to treat with kid gloves is obviously Federico Chiesa. Now, he is in a similar boat in as much as he could start, but he won't be playing the whole 90 minutes. That was what Arne Slot said. So if he starts, don't expect him to finish the game. It might even be that he gets 45 minutes, either the first or the second half, which is obviously a positive because it would have been more minutes than he's seen for quite a while now. But again, it's another indication that just because he's back training doesn't mean he's immediately ready to go and to play minutes after minutes after minutes. He's still having to treat them very carefully, still very fragile at the moment, which is obviously a shame for him and for the team. But I think we're in a situation now where whatever it takes to get him ready to go, I think that's what we have to do. Now, I mentioned before that Arne Slot may have revealed more than he intended to, and one of the things around that was him when he was talking about the defence in particular. He was asked about the fact that there's only really 4 fit and available defenders for this game and how he would manage those things, and does the likes of James Norris or Amara Nialo come into consideration from the youth team? Well, the news there is very much that they will come into consideration. I would expect both of them, based on what Arne Slot said, to see some minutes. Slot went as far as to say that it was unlikely that, reading between the lines, he said this, I don't think he actually could be quoted to say it, it was unlikely that most, if not all, of those regular 4 first team defenders would play the whole 90 minutes. So some of them would start, some of them would finish, none of them particularly. Maybe Jurel Quansah, who still is looking for some more minutes, he might be the only one who gets the full 90, whereas elsewhere you might see some of those other ones come in. Intriguingly though, it wasn't just the youth players that was highlighted as who may come in. There was also talk once again of makeshift defender. Well, he didn't call them makeshift, I'd call them makeshift. Creative solutions is probably more what he said, which is fascinating because obviously the guy who we instantly think of in that scenario is Ryan Gravenberch, who fulfilled that role in the last game against Fulham and fulfilled it very well. But the suspicion is that this is one of the games where he would get a rest and probably needs a rest. So then who else is there who could be a makeshift defender? Well, Wataru Endo has played centre-back for Stuttgart in the Bundesliga, and that was one of the things that was touted about him when he joined the club. So perhaps we might see some minutes of Wataru Endo playing centre-half against Southampton, which is a fascinating prospect, particularly if a 6'5" Paul Anawacho is playing for Southampton. That might well be a bit of a mismatch, but we'll have to wait and see there exactly how it all shakes up. Speaking of Southampton, that brings me to top takeaway number 2. Now, the interim manager may spring a surprise. Slot was asked about the difficulty of game planning for a team that don't have a manager, and particularly one that's been changing a few of their formations, as it was in the last game against Spurs. They did go from a back 4 to a back 5 quite early on. I think it was 13 minutes in when they were already 3-0 down. So there's an element of you're not quite sure what you're going to get from them. The interim manager, Simon Rusk, Slot mentioned the fact that he does seem to favour a 4-man defence, but he wasn't entirely sure about it. But the thing that was fascinating for me is that Slot kind of gave an insight into the thought process of a manager, particularly an interim manager there, because there might well be a slight disconnect between the ambitions of the man and the ambitions of the team. Slot mentioned the fact that it depends on how long he's going to be the interim manager for. If it's just for one game, then he probably will just kind of toe the party line. Whereas if he's going to be there longer, then maybe this becomes a bit of an audition for him. Now, the difference there is that if he was towing the party line, as I said, you would expect them to rest some of their starters, maybe most of their starters, with a view to the game against Fulham at the weekend, which, as we know, will be a very tough one for them, and it's probably a much bigger priority in terms of maintaining their Premier League status for next season. However, if Simon Rusk is wanting to put himself in the shop window, then what better way to do it than putting a full team out there against the team at Liverpool, who we've already discussed is probably going to be quite heavily rotated with lots of youth players in there, and getting a win against the league leaders on his CV. Because let's face it, from Southampton's point of view, they can look at the league game that happened to St Mary's a couple of weeks ago and say that they came close to winning that game with their full team against Liverpool's full team. So their full team against Liverpool's reserve team may well get that win. And yes, you can look at it and say, well, is that really what he wants to do? But sometimes with managers, you have to think about how their career is going compared to what the team needs. And this might be one of those times. I'm not entirely sure how long Simon Rusk will be in the chair for. Maybe that's something we need to watch out for when he does his press conference over the next 24 hours or so. But it's definitely something that will come into Arne Slot's thinking when he's trying to prepare the game. Luckily for us, we know that Arne Slot is the kind of guy who's very thorough in his preparations. We've already spoken about how he tries to give his team so many different scenarios to plan for ahead of game in which they will be able to work out during the game. So he'll be planning for a 4-man defence, for a 5-man defence, for a reserve Southampton team and for the full Southampton team. And hopefully Liverpool will be ready to face whoever it is they come up against. Top takeaway number 3 for Slot. Staying cool is no longer that easy. Now, one of the things we've been most impressed by with Arne Slot when he's come into this Liverpool group is the fact that he has been so calm and so measured throughout his tenure, in a bit of a contrast to the rather highly strung Jurgen Klopp who preceded him. But it's not as easy as it looks, and it's getting harder and harder. I think it's fair to say 4 months in the Premier League has already started to stress him out a little bit. He's currently going to be banned for the Southampton game because he's picked up his 3rd yellow card against Fulham. Anyone who's seen some of the footage of him on the sideline will know that he wasn't particularly calm for most of that game. And yes, we're starting to see maybe the performances / incompetence of the referees here in this country is starting to drive him to distraction a little bit. I think it was interesting that the way he framed it. He said that the referees are more likely to make him lose his temper than his players because his players are more likely to make good decisions than the referees. Now, he said all of this while joking. He was very keen to stress that he was going to address this in a very jovial manner, but he still felt like he needed to address it. It's fascinating as well when talking earlier about the Southampton interim manager that he referenced Gary O'Neill and how unlucky he was to lose his job in the face of some very interesting or wrong refereeing decisions as he saw it. So this is something that clearly is in his mind, and clearly he's trying to not let it affect him, but he also wants the world to know that yes, Liverpool have been hard done by here quite a few times. And I think if you're the manager of a big team, it's a very difficult balance to like, because you don't want to feel like the referees and the assistants are going to start to maybe ignore you or dismiss you because you're ranting too much or you're going on about it too much. But by the same token, there are some times when you can influence these people, or you can maybe attempt to influence these people. And that's something else that Arne Slot revealed. Paul Joyce asked him if he'd wanted to reflect on how he deals with referees in the wake of this suspension. And Arne Slot basically admitted that sometimes when he gets angry on the sideline, he's trying to influence the referees to give more decisions in their favour. Something that apparently worked when he was in Holland, but according to him has not worked here in the UK on either side. He's tried to do it against Chelsea and against Fulham. So maybe we will see a different Arne Slot on the sideline, but it is fascinating to know that managers are very tactical, or can be very tactical in how they act on the sideline. I mean, to most of us observing, it looks like they're just human men who are emotional and let the whims of a game get on top of them, and sometimes they can't help themselves. But sometimes they're doing it on purpose. Sometimes they want the referee to know they're upset. And I think someone like Slot, who, as I said, doesn't have that kind of high threshold for losing his temper. He tends to do it very, very infrequently. But when he does do it, maybe that makes more of an impact. So maybe that's what we've been seeing recently. We'll have to wait and see exactly how it affects him going forward. Now, in terms of the ban, I think it was also interesting to note that there's a difference between how England ban their managers and how they do it in Holland. In as much as in Holland, he's not allowed to do the press, he's not allowed in the dressing room, a full-time or a half-time. Whereas here in England, he's just not allowed to stand on the sideline. And when you consider how good Arne Slot and his coaching team have been at getting a improved performance out of the side during the half-time break. Thankfully, I'm very, very glad to see that he's still going to be able to have that influence against Southampton on Wednesday night. So it's time to address my question. First of all, I want to kind of give a shout out to a couple of people. Firstly, Tony Barrett, the Liverpool press officer, who helped me kind of make up my mind. We had a nice little chat before the press conference started. It kind of formulated a few things in my mind, allowed me some ideas about which direction is the smart one to go into, the kind of things that Arne Slot will and won't respond to. Now, these are the kind of conversations that happen with all journalists at times, or once you've been in the room quite a few times, you can see how the ecosystem works. So there are certain things where it helps you to maybe try and get some inside information a little bit beforehand, so you can avoid a question that's going to get completely shut down. And this was one of those times. I also want to give a shout out to Josh Williams of Distance Covered, of the Redmen TV, of Anfield Rap. If you aren't on his Substack, go and get onto his Substack, it's very good. He and I did a show together yesterday, and after the show we were discussing things, and one of the things we were discussing is how much Arne Slot seems to hate draws and how he always goes for the win in whatever situation. And we were discussing it in terms of how it differs from Mikel Arteta and Arsenal, who have been very keen or very happy to settle for draws in their two biggest games of the season so far, perhaps in slightly different circumstances. But it was something about the mentality and what that says to the rest of the team that I was very interested in, and that's what influenced my question, as you can hear now.
Hi Arne, it's been notable in all the games that Liverpool haven't been winning towards the end that you've been willing with your tactics and your substitutions to maybe sacrifice a defeat in the pursuit of a win. Even in situations where maybe a draw would be creditable, like away at Arsenal or down to 10 men for 70 minutes, for example. Has this always been your philosophy, or have you maybe been influenced by the group who've been so good at winning games late on?
It is a combination of both. It's always been my philosophy since I've been a manager to try to win the game in the end. But it's definitely also that our players have this same mentality long before I came here. So it's probably also the mentality of the club, it's the mentality of the players. Maybe that's also one of the reasons why they brought me in, because it's also my mentality to try to win every game, even if we're in a situation like you said where you can accept a draw as well. But it's the mentality we have together, and that's why we are at this moment of time happy with each other.
As you can see there in his answer, he was very keen to stress exactly how much his philosophy marries up with that of the squad, and is rather than him dictating to them, it's both of them coming together with a common mind and a common bond. And to be honest, that's exactly what you need when you're a manager coming into a new group. You need as many areas of shared experience and shared ideas as possible. And he also flagged up the idea that this is probably part of the reason why he was brought in by Michael Edwards and Richard Hughes. And to be honest, that's probably true. And it's another really pertinent point at a time when so many clubs are looking for a new manager, or maybe not 100% sure about the one that they've currently got. The amount of things that you can bring to the table that are perfect for the team you have are so important. It's not just about tactics. It's not just been about a big name who can handle big personalities. It's about mentality. It's about philosophy. It's about seeing things the same way. And I think that there's a real symbiotic connection between Arne Slot and this group of players, which is helping them adapt to his ideas so quickly and helping us get results. Hopefully this leads to another result against Southampton. Obviously, as I mentioned, he's not going to be on the sideline, but there was a shout out to Sipka and to John Heitinga, who will be on the sideline, no doubt shouting his instructions. And it was very keen that he was happy to give them praise for their own work, but very much keen to say also that this is part of the same group. They once again are another group who all think the same way about football, so it helps when he's not around that they can reinforce his ideas without necessarily wanting to go rogue, like Simon Russ may well end up being. But we'll have to wait and see what influence that has on the game. That is today's press conference review. Thank you as always for watching. There will be another one of these on Friday ahead of the game against Spurs, but for now, see you soon.